Okay, I'm really happy to be here, happy to be talking to you, and happy to be closing out the discussion today. I represent the Greater Houston Flood Mitigation Consortium, which is actually something pretty extraordinary. After Harvey, a couple of local foundations decided, let's get together some of the best researchers, some of the best thinkers on flooding, on ecology, on urban planning in this region, and see what we can do if we get them all talking together. And one of the products of that is a document we released earlier this year called Strategies for Flood Mitigation. And that includes a section called Conclusions, which are the things where we got together and got agreement from all of these experts on a couple of major ideas. And I brought copies of that, so there's a box right here, so afterwards feel free to grab a copy if you're interested, and I'll give you a brief tour of those conclusions now. So this is the area we looked at, really the watersheds running through Harris County, which don't extend far to the south and to the west, but quite far to the north. And what we really saw was, as a region, we need a paradigm shift in how we think about flooding. And some of that has already happened. We've gone from lining bayous in concrete to much more natural bayous. And in Harvey, we saw that that actually works very well. But we need to go beyond that. We need to realize that everybody is at risk of flooding, that regulations and building regulations really need to cover the areas beyond the floodplains, that buyouts can be more than just a way to avoid future flood insurance payouts, that open space preservation is effective flood mitigation, that planning should focus on minimizing the effects of people rather than the effects on property, and that really we need to build a culture of living with flooding because flooding will not go away. And that, in fact, now I have a there it goes. That, in fact, was our first big conclusion. It is not possible to solve flooding. We will always have flooding. Our goal should be to minimize the impacts that that flooding has on this region. And that means doing the right assessments. And one of our big problems right now is the federal government's cost-benefit ratio values property, not people. It says that if $1 million house floods, that is 10 times as bad as a $100,000 house flooding. What we're saying is we really should be valuing people and not property in making these decisions. And it also means we need a lot better information. For example, we don't know the elevations of all of the slabs in the county, and that's the difference between a property flooding, which is not that bad, and a house flooding, which is catastrophic. That's information that's simply missing. And the way we map floodplains is probably the wrong way to think about it. There's no magic line where on one side of that you have flood risk and on the other side you don't. It's a gradient of risk as you move across that. And we can probably do a much better job of mapping that. Not the way the feds map it, but we can develop our own ways of thinking about it locally. We also came to a really dramatic conclusion about how different watersheds function, that even with currently planned projects built out, the level of protection in different watersheds is greatly different. That in some watersheds, even if the full federal projects are built out, there's still houses flooding in a 10% event, while some other watersheds are protected to better than a 1% event. And I will say, having just looked across the projects list that Matt and the Flood Control District have put together, I think that list makes a real attempt to remedy this. We also believe that public input is absolutely critical to this. We need a public discussion about what kind of projects are best, and we need that discussion to build the buy-in to fund these projects over a long period of time. We think that flood alert systems could be a lot better if we give people a 2 or 3 hour warning of your neighborhood is likely to flood. They can do things with those 2 and 3 hours that can greatly reduce the impact of that flooding. And we could also do a much better job of disclosing flooding risks. There are apartments up in Greenspoint which got flooded out, those tenants moved out, landlord rehabs it, immediately rents it out to a new set of tenants without telling them that they are living in a floodway. There's been a lot of talk about flooding regulations, but a lot of that is really focused on numbers, on sort of what is the floor slab elevation of a house. There's other issues with the regulatory system, and one of them is there are a lot of jurisdictions involved, even on a single piece of property. If you are in the City of Houston ETJ, you might have the city handle your platting, the county handle your infrastructure and your building regulations, and then who handles your detention depends on whose facility you drain into, which could be City of Houston or county or the flood control district. So you can have one piece of property with 3 different regulatory agencies looking at that one piece of property. We also have the problem that in unincorporated areas, counties have many fewer regulatory powers than cities do, which also holds back the ability to deal with flooding. And even though we have detention regulations in place across the region, our current regulations do not fully address the impacts of development. And if new development happens and meets current regulations, it still increases downstream flooding. We also, if we're talking about regulations, that does nothing about all of these existing houses across the region, which is really the core of our flooding problem and something we need to do a lot more thinking about. We also are not doing nearly enough thinking about local drainage. This is a map of the Memorial City area. On the left, you will see what FEMA maps as floodplains. On the right, you will see what a local drainage study found was the actual floodplain. Flooding in our local drainage systems, the ones that are responsibility of the city and the county, not the flood control district, is a huge part of our flooding problem. And this is a big part of why people who don't live in floodplains are finding that they're flooding. And we don't even understand this problem. This kind of modeling has been done only in a few places. And so there is real potential to deal with flooding by focusing on local drainage. And we also think there's real potential in small-scale lot-by-lot strategies. Buyouts are a really valuable tool. We think that they should really be seen and studied alongside structural solutions. In other words, buyouts shouldn't just be the last resort to deal with places that we can't solve by building detention or widening a bayou. We should look at that as an alternative form of project. And the more public outreach we do around them, the more case management, the more relocation assistance, the more people will volunteer. One of the biggest problems with buyouts is this. You do a voluntary buyout program, you end up with the people shaded here selling their homes, the people not shaded not selling. You end up with a half-empty neighborhood, and that really doesn't work well for anyone. We think that there's, through funding sources, through outreach, through case management, etc., there are ways to remedy that. We also are concerned that buyouts could actually really address the housing supply in this area, that if we do too much of this, it'll actually be a lot harder to find affordable housing in this region. And so we need to do a housing plan alongside all of this flood control work. And we also think there's alternatives to buyouts. That in cases where flooding is relatively shallow and houses are built close to the ground, instead of demolishing that house and keeping that property empty, maybe you buy that property and then sell it to a developer with restrictions so that they can build a new house there, but it has to be elevated above the flood levels, and that neighborhood remains active, that property remains on the tax base. There's a housing unit there. We also, big conclusion, simply increasing the capacity of our waterways is generally not the most effective way to deal with flooding. In fact, it can make flooding worse because if we speed up that water heading downstream, it tends to pile up on itself. And that in many cases, one of our best strategies can actually be to preserve undeveloped land. I imagine Brays Bayou today. Imagine if we had retained 200 or 500 feet worth of property on both sides of that bayou in its natural state instead of building on it, how much better that watershed would function today. The current federal projects all do a lot of good and will get a lot of homes with reduced flood risk, but there's more work to be done in all of these watersheds. That includes tributaries. A lot of the major tributaries like Brickhouse Gully and Little White Oak were not a part of those federal studies and are not addressed by them. Again, when I look at the flood controls project list, I see a lot of those addressed in that list. And there's some entire watersheds which really have not gotten much attention. What we did is we actually mapped population, budget, and Harvey damages. And what we noticed is there's a couple watersheds that have a lot of population and a lot of damages and very few proposed projects. Cypress, for example, on the north side of Harris County, Armand Bayou and Vince Bayou both all fall into that category. Those watersheds really need that attention. And a lot of the issues, as actually got brought up earlier, railroad bridges, TxDOT projects, are a big part of the issue here. The reason why Independence Heights floods is because TxDOT built a very small culvert when they originally built 610. Every transportation project we have is a chance to also address flooding. And the more collaboration we have between agencies, the more of those opportunities we have. We'll also note some of the major watersheds. San Jacinto River really needs to be much better understood. Addicks and Barker reservoirs, we don't really know what the risk of failure of those two reservoirs is, and that needs to be understood. The third reservoir plan that's out there, the plan that actually got studied was really focused on reducing the impacts of future development, but we think there's real potential out there for a reservoir that could help Cypress Creek. And so that deserves some more attention. The North Canal near downtown could be a really good project. Like I said, there's a lot more in the report, and as a consortium, we've also put out a lot of fact sheets on different aspects of flooding. You can find all of that on our website, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
But we'll hold those questions until after the next presentation.
I'm going to see if I'm smart enough to work this computer.
Press any button.
All right, hey, there we go. Now, let's see if we can.
So it's working fine. Just let me see the screen.
There we go. All right. Hi, my name is Augie Campbell. I'm the president and CEO of the West Houston Association, and I'm also chair of Harris Plus Flood Solutions. And we've put together a coalition called Houston Stronger. And for, I guess, about the past, well, we formed the 501c4 in January of this year. And the real goal is to bring together different institutions with different ideas on how to address the situations that we found our different communities in. We had a lot of emails on our flood control committee from our executive committee, from our members, who either flooded or they lived in neighborhoods that had seen substantial flooding. It's no secret that West Houston has been affected not just by Hurricane Harvey, but by the Texas Day floods and even by the Memorial Day floods. So I've spent a lot of time with Matt Zeeve's colleagues, pretty much since I started. I started with the West Houston Association back in 2015, November. Before that, I was an assistant city attorney at the city of Houston for 7.5 years, and I worked on water rights issues. So I will say that back in 2009, there was flooding at the city, and then by 2011, the biggest issue I had was the drought. And I had actually just started at the city right before Hurricane Ike. So if we think that flooding is the only problem our community faces, we are wrong. Resiliency is more than flood control. It's remembering that all these things can happen to our community and making the right investments. We think that flood control is a very important investment. And it's not just us. So we got together with ACEC, which is the engineering group, Greater Houston Builders Association, Houston Realtors, a whole bunch of people. You can see all the names up there. We have a monthly meeting. We have about 27 institutions that come to our meeting. At our last meeting, we had Congressman Culberson. He was, as Matt Zeeve said, instrumental in getting $141 billion that we need to rebuild communities. And it's not just Texas. There are 22 other states and territories that can potentially access this money, and I'll talk together. But just to go back to Houston Stronger and talk about what we're trying to do as an organization. We're trying to develop goals and processes to make sure that we get the funding that we need from the federal government, state government, and local government. We're also trying to come up with some ideas on how we can present to these different agencies, because we have some amazingly intelligent people who are, engineers, architects. There's a range of different professions who can really bring a lot of good ideas to the conversation. And I think one of the things that I've been so impressed with from the county especially is their ability to take good ideas, and often they've already had the ideas, and they can tell us what they've done on them. So that's really heartening for us. The other thing is working through the legal framework. Matt talked about how on June 12th, there will be a vote by the Harris County Commissioners Court for this $2.5 billion in funding. There's been a conversation with, literally tens of organizations looking at the proposed order, making sure that we have good language to present to voters. And I think, again, the county has really done a great job of involving different stakeholders in that process. And then political consensus. If you flooded, you weren't a Republican or a Democrat, you were someone who wanted government to work. And I think that's what we all want, and that's really what unites our organization. If you go back, you can see that, we have Houston Wilderness, National Association of Minority Contractors, and then there are a lot of groups who participate who, for one reason or another, I don't have the permission to put their logos up there, but they're very involved, and they've done a great job of providing us with good information so we can have a conversation about plans like this. Now, we've talked a little bit about the $2.5 billion bond. I'm here to tell you that that is a small down payment on what we need to truly fix flooding in our area. To provide a 100-year level of protection to the entirety of Harris County takes at least $35 billion. If you want to fix flooding in the region and storm surge, the price tag on that, based on our estimates, and I'm just a lawyer, I didn't come up with these. We have a bunch of engineers and other professionals who've developed these models. It's $58 billion. There are a lot of concepts that we need to talk about. We can do a lot with the existing infrastructure that we have, and we'll talk more about that. But if we don't get the funding and we don't move on these ideas quickly, we will miss a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to at least do something that will make sure that we're safer and we can tell the world we're not we've not gone from space city to flood city. So I talked about the $141 billion for disasters. As Matt said, the communities who will get their share of $141 billion are those communities that have a local match. The city has applied for money, much like the county, for home buyouts, and has a much harder time getting them because they don't have that local match. There will be CDBG funding. Maybe it'll come in November, but if you were there in Hurricane Ike, you know that the city of Houston was promised billions in CDBG funding. We still have not, the city of Houston has still not received it. And a lot of it is because you have to go through the National Disaster Recovery Framework, aka the Stafford Act. And, Judge Emmett talked about how he is, the on-the-ground official that reports under this process. You have, the mayor has appointed Marvin Odom, and at the state level, John Sharp, the chancellor in A&M, is the state coordinating officer. So all of this money that Matt talked about has to flow through this process. And so it comes down, and you'll see that there are various matches. I mean, this is a great chart, and if you look at it long enough, you see that there are some great opportunities, and then there are some buckets that are going to be a lot harder for us. So one of the things that we've talked to Matt about a lot is, leveraging these dollars, because $2.5 billion is not $35 billion, and you can leverage it so we get a lot closer. In fact, Matt's already, and his associates have come up with a way to leverage $1 billion to between $4 and $5 billion, and that's a great start. But when you need $35 billion to fix the problem, we're hoping we can do more, and you need money, not just to complete everything on this list. I will say that this is a great start, and I encourage all of you to go and look at this. And one thing I will point out about this is this fixes a lot of floodplain issues. 68% of the flooding, and y'all were here yesterday, and Jeff Linder pointed this out, 68% of the flooding occurred outside of the floodplain. So even if we fix these channels, that doesn't mean we fix flooding. And so the city is working hard on an approach. They've come up with some ideas to negotiate to get different funding streams. But it's going to be hard unless they have the dedicated funding they get right now from Rebuild Houston. That's going to be back on the ballot in November, and if they don't have that, they're going to have nothing for a local match, or the local match that they can anticipate reasonably will be gone. So basically, without Rebuild Houston, this timeline goes away, or at least is substantially different. Now, when we've been, the reason I'm up on the stage is because we have a dollar amount. We have a plan with a price tag. That doesn't mean this is the end-all be-all plan. If you ask me if I thought this is exactly what we were going to do, I would say absolutely not. This is a model, and all models are wrong, but some are useful. And this is very useful for having a conversation about the level of protection that our community should have and the amount of money it'll take to get there. So if we're talking about level of protection, we've designed historically for probable maximum rainfall. And the only time that we've really developed a plan that would guard against probable maximum rainfall was the 1940 plan put out by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so they anticipated back then that probable maximum rainfall would be 34 inches. And there's some folks in the audience who know these numbers much better than I do. So I'm not going to get into this too much, except to say that, that was relatively close to the storm event that fell on top of Addicks and Barker. The problem is that the reservoirs didn't catch all the water that they were supposed to catch. And if we're talking about what we would like to see on our bayous, we'd like to see Sims Bayou. Now, there were 6,000 homes that flooded in the Sims Bayou watershed, but none of those homes flooded due to riverine flooding. It was local drainage issues. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but and that's because we paid for a 100-year flood event. I mean, it's 12 inches in 24 hours. So we think that if we can equip our major channels to provide that 100-year level of protection, 12 inches in 24 hours, we can avoid major riverine flooding. That doesn't mean we fix the problem. We've also talked a lot about a third reservoir. Third reservoir, this is Plan 5 that was developed by the Harris County Flood Control District. The West Houston Association, Katy Prairie Conservancy were very involved in that study. I think all of us today think that it needs further consideration. And there's a 216 study that the Corps hopefully will fund. The Flood Control District's already put up its money, so we can look further at this. One thing that we think we can do is work with existing infrastructure. If you have to buy out upstream and downstream of Addicks and Barker Reservoir, that costs approximately $6 billion. We think there's a better way to take care of this. If you were to excavate 6 feet out of Addicks and 10 feet out of Barker reservoirs on average, then that would allow for the rain that fell during Harvey. So 110,000 acre feet in Barker or 210,000 acre feet in Barker and 200,000 acre feet in Addicks to be caught on government-owned land. By excavating, you're also going to expand the base of the reservoir and prevent that catastrophic flood event where basically the water pushes over the berm and all that water equalizes out over, over Memorial, River Oaks, and to the ship channel downtown. We've been planning for a long time. There are some great ideas, and we're getting back to some of them. Bayou Greenways 2020 really picked up on the Comey plan that was developed back in 1912. And we think that there are a lot of benefits from doing this. And one of them is if we get homes and we provide space on both sides of the bayou, we do less of this. Because I don't want to ever do things like this again. I don't know about y'all. So that will require a lot of buyouts. And, if you want to see more about the buyout process, go to the Harris County Flood Control District website. They have the best buyout program in the nation. The issue is, as Christof pointed out, is to work with the City of Houston and the Harris County Community Services Department to provide replacement affordable housing. And that will be a huge challenge. And we're very encouraged by the way that the Flood Control District and different agencies are working on that problem. So as Christof said, strategic buyouts are a great way to go forward. If we have checkerboarding, we can't do that. So we also need to concentrate on certain areas. You see that And this information is now outdated. I didn't have the benefit of the report that Jeff put out yesterday whenever I came up with this presentation. But still, you can notice that, Cypress had many flooded homes and essentially doesn't have the protection that it needs. So we think we need about $8.5 billion in strategic buyouts to provide this 100-year level of protection. And when you build it, we think it should be in this sort of configuration, using geofluvial morphology and trying to use native vegetation. So again, this is not going to work in every neighborhood. I mean, there are going to be areas where maybe a flood tunnel is a better idea. I'm not saying that we have all the answers. We want to engage with the folks who do and make sure that we have good plans. We think the flood control district's done a great job with their idea behind buyouts and their channel configuration. In fact, a lot of the things that I showed you on the screen, they've already incorporated on their Little Cypress Creek projects and in other projects on Langham Creek. So we know how to do that. We also know that there are other benefits just besides flood protection. The treatment that we're talking about will provide the same sort of benefits that Bayou Greenways 2020 provided. So that's $90 million for the Bayou Greenways 2020 project. That was a $110 million bond project. So I'm not going to say that we'll get the same level of benefit on every watershed, but we're still talking about projects that will reduce our overall health spending and will also improve property values in areas that have a need to improve. So we hope for a lot of coordination. We also hope to make sure that we get flood funding back up. Back in 2000, for every $100 of valuation that we had, 8 cents of that went to flood control. Today, that number is less than 2.8 cents of valuation. We're going the wrong way. So if we don't vote on August 25th to provide for this $2.5 billion in capital funding, we're never going to get those numbers back where they need to be, or it's going to be unlikely that we will. And we've been talking about this for a long time. West Houston Association, back in our 2050 plan, we said back then that we drastically underfund flood control. We had there have been a lot of plans to really improve our bayous, and we think those need to be taken seriously. And we need to build what the flood control district already has on the books. They have some fantastic projects. They need to be funded. And we need to look at these reservoirs that are potentially out there. But I have to tell you, this third reservoir will take at least 15 years to build, and that's Usain Bolt speed. We are not going to build this quickly, even if everybody agrees. And I have to say that Katy Prairie Conservancy makes some very compelling arguments about why we need to be very careful whenever we build it. We also need to remember that hurricanes aren't just about rain. So we need storm surge protection. I don't think this is a perfect project, but I do think that there's been some good work done, and we need to look at other potential solutions. We also need to look at the Brazos River too. Don't forget, this isn't just a Harris County issue. This is a regional issue, and we want to support Brazos County. And also, if you're going to solve Harris County's issues, you have to start in Montgomery County and build that Montgomery County reservoir system or something that has similar impact. I talked about local drainage a few times. We estimate that'll cost $6 billion to take care of those issues. Port of Houston needs substantial assistance. Freeport actually just passed a bond referendum. I think it's $130 million instead of $140 million, but that's great news, and we need other communities. Fort Bend will have a bond election in 2019, we anticipate. We will need more study in certain areas. We just haven't got around to it. So if y'all have ideas, we'd love to hear from you. These are where we are at so far in our conversation. We'd like you to be a part of it. If you'd like to learn more, go to HoustonStronger.net and send us your questions and your ideas. We'd like to hear them. Thank you.